For a few weeks, the world believed the Iran war was over. A ceasefire had been signed, oil markets had calmed down, diplomats were quietly working on the next phase of talks, and then, in the span of about 48 hours, all of it collapsed. On July 8, 2026, standing at the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, President Donald Trump looked at reporters and said, "As far as he's concerned, the ceasefire with Iran is over." Hours later, the United States military confirmed it had struck approximately 90 Iranian military targets along Iran's coastline. And before the sun even came up the next morning, Iran had already hit back, not against the United States directly, but against 4 different countries hosting American military assets: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan. 4 nations, thousands of miles apart, suddenly pulled into a war that was supposed to have ended weeks earlier. Today, we're breaking down exactly how this ceasefire fell apart, what Trump actually said that pushed it over the edge, what the U.S. hit, and why and how Iran managed to turn a regional airstrike into a 4-country retaliation campaign in less than a day. Stay to the end, because the diplomatic fallout from this single 48-hour window may end up reshaping the entire Middle East for months to come. Let's rewind slightly, because understanding how we got here matters more than just reacting to the headline. Back on June 17th, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, laying out the terms for an extended 60-day ceasefire. The idea was to buy time for deeper technical negotiations, with a deadline set for roughly mid-August. Behind the scenes, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner had reportedly met with mediators in Doha near the end of June to keep the process moving. But according to reporting at the time, those meetings never escalated into direct, high-level talks with Iranian officials. The ceasefire, in other words, was never fully solid. It was a fragile pause, held together by cautious diplomacy rather than genuine trust, and it took surprisingly little to knock it over. The spark came on Tuesday, July 7th. Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels navigating the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy shipping corridors on Earth, according to U.S. Central Command and the Joint Maritime Information Center. In response, the United States immediately revoked its waiver on Iranian oil sanctions, a waiver that had been part of the ceasefire terms just weeks earlier. Then came the first wave of American retaliation. U.S. forces launched strikes on roughly 80 Iranian targets that same day, including more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats, according to CENTCOM. At that point, the situation was already serious. But it was Wednesday, July 8th, when things truly spiraled. Standing in Ankara for the NATO summit, Trump was asked directly why he had so quickly turned on Iran's leadership, having praised them just a month earlier as smart and reasonable to deal with. His answer was blunt. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to make a deal with Tehran anymore, and that it was time to, in his words, finish the job. He went further, describing Iran's leadership using far harsher language than he had used in previous weeks, calling them erratic and dangerous. As far as the ceasefire was concerned, Trump told reporters plainly that it was over. Within hours, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces had completed another wave of strikes, this time hitting approximately 90 Iranian military targets along the coastline. According to CENTCOM's official statement, the strikes were aimed at further degrading Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, and the targets included air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, missile and drone storage sites, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure. But here's where the story gets genuinely unusual. Most of the American strikes throughout this renewed conflict had focused tightly on southern Iran, near the Strait of Hormuz itself, the geographic center of the maritime dispute. Then, early Thursday morning, U.S. cruise missiles struck an area around a bridge in Akala County in Iran's northeastern Golestan province, according to a unit of the Revolutionary Guard stationed in that region. Iranian state broadcaster IRIB reported hearing an explosion in Golestan. What makes this strike stand out isn't just the target, it's the distance. Golestan sits roughly 900 miles away from the Strait of Hormuz, far outside the zone where nearly all the prior fighting had been concentrated. CENTCOM's official statement didn't even mention the bridge strike, and CNN reported it had reached out to the U.S. military for comment without an immediate response. Whether this represents a deliberate widening of the target list, or a signal that Trump's threats to hit deeper into Iranian infrastructure were becoming real, remains unclear. And that uncertainty matters. Trump had, in fact, renewed a threat at the NATO summit to potentially target critical civilian infrastructure inside Iran, specifically mentioning electric plants and desalination plants, a level of escalation that would go far beyond the military and naval targets hit so far. Trump's public rhetoric throughout these 2 days was about as direct as it gets. He warned that if Iran targeted any more vessels in the strait, the American military response would, in his words, get much worse. In a social media post, he framed the strikes as retribution for the vessel attacks, telling Iran plainly that any additional hit against shipping would be met with even heavier retaliation. At one point, describing the exchange, he said that for every time Iran hits the United States, America hits back 20 times harder. Whether or not you agree with that kind of rhetoric, it set the tone for exactly how aggressive this round of the conflict would become. Now let's get into how Iran actually responded, because this is the part of the story that turned a US-Iran dispute into a 4-country regional crisis almost overnight. According to Iran's army, carried through the semi-official Fars news agency, Iranian forces targeted a Patriot missile interceptor system inside Kuwait. They also targeted an early warning satellite antenna site in Qatar, and they hit fuel storage facilities in Bahrain. The stated method was a large number of different types of attack drones launched simultaneously across multiple fronts. This wasn't a single missile lobbed in anger. It was a coordinated, multi-target retaliation designed to hit American military infrastructure spread across the Gulf without striking the American homeland directly, keeping the conflict regional rather than triggering an even larger global escalation. Let's go country by country, because each nation's experience that night looked different. In Kuwait, the Ministry of Defense confirmed that 4 missiles and 10 drone attacks were intercepted. Despite the successful intercepts, one person was still injured by falling debris, a reminder that even a mostly successful missile defense operation can still produce real casualties on the ground. In Bahrain, the Ministry of Interior issued multiple public warnings urging civilians to seek shelter as the overnight attacks unfolded, treating the threat seriously enough to activate a broad public alert system. In Qatar, authorities raised their official security threat level, issuing what was described as an elevated alert as the region absorbed the shock of the strikes. And then there's Jordan, the 4th country pulled into this. According to reporting, Iran fired 10 ballistic missiles at a U.S. military base in northern Jordan. The Jordanian government confirmed that it had intercepted the incoming Iranian missiles before they could do damage, though the missiles did breach Jordanian airspace and trigger air raid sirens across the affected area. The U.S. Embassy in Jordan issued its own security alert, warning residents that missiles, drones, or rockets were active in Jordanian airspace and advising people to seek overhead cover. 4 countries. 1 overnight window. All of it a direct consequence of a ceasefire that had held together for barely 3 weeks. The diplomatic reaction across the region was swift and largely unified in its concern. Qatar's foreign minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, spoke directly with Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and condemned the earlier Iranian attacks on commercial vessels, warning that this kind of action undermines trust and threatens international maritime security, according to a statement released by Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Egypt's foreign ministry went further, publicly denouncing the Iranian strikes on Bahrain and Kuwait, specifically as a dangerous escalation and an unacceptable violation. These aren't minor diplomatic footnotes. When Gulf and regional powers start issuing formal condemnations within hours of an attack, it signals just how seriously the entire region is treating the collapse of the ceasefire, and how quickly countries that weren't originally part of the US-Iran dispute found themselves forced to respond publicly. On the Iranian side, the political messaging was defiant rather than conciliatory. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's parliament speaker and one of the country's most powerful political figures, currently leading Iran's side of negotiations with the United States, posted a pointed warning aimed squarely at Washington. His message was blunt. If you strike, you'll get hit back. He added that America still hasn't learned that bullying and breaking promises come at a cost, and insisted that the Strait of Hormuz would only reopen fully under what he called Iranian arrangements, not American threats. That's a significant statement because it signals Iran isn't approaching this as a moment to de-escalate and return to the negotiating table. It's approaching it as a test of resolve, one where backing down first is seen as a political and strategic loss. There's also a human cost to this round of strikes that's important to include, because accurate reporting on a war means including the casualty figures alongside the military and political maneuvering. According to Iran's own health ministry, the American strikes across July 8th and 9th killed 14 people and injured 78 others across 5 separate provinces. Separately, the American strikes reportedly knocked out power in parts of Iran's southeastern Chabahar County, with local electricity lines temporarily impacted, according to semi-official Iranian state media. On the other side, in Kuwait, at least one person was injured by falling debris from intercepted Iranian projectiles. These numbers will likely be revised and contested as more information emerges, which is normal in the early days of any conflict. But they underscore that this isn't just a story about missile trajectories and geopolitical posturing. Real people in multiple countries were caught inside the consequences of this ceasefire collapsing. Timing matters here too, in ways that add another layer of tension to an already volatile moment. This entire exchange of strikes happened during the same week that Iran was burying its late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in the holy city of Mashhad, following days of public mourning ceremonies. The atmosphere inside Iran during this period was already emotionally charged and divided. Public reaction to Khamenei's death and funeral has reportedly been deeply mixed. Some Iranians turned out to mourn, carrying his image through crowded streets, with some demonstrators unfurling banners written in English rather than Farsi, seemingly aimed at an international audience, calling for consequences against President Trump. But according to on-the-ground reporting, many other Iranians felt little connection to the mourning at all, associating Khamenei's rule with years of suppressed dissent, with some residents reportedly treating the funeral period as an opportunity to simply leave increasingly congested cities rather than participate. This isn't a footnote. A country conducting a major, emotionally divisive state funeral for its former supreme leader, while simultaneously trading airstrikes with the United States and 3 of its neighbors, is a nation under an extraordinary amount of internal and external pressure all at once. The economic ripple effects were immediate and global. The moment Trump declared the ceasefire over, oil markets reacted violently. U.S. crude oil surged more than 4% that day, jumping as high as $76 a barrel, before closing up 4.4% at $73.52, marking its largest single-day increase since early June. International Brent crude spiked even higher, touching $80 a barrel intraday, before settling at $78.02, up 5.8% on the day. Combined across the 2 days of escalating conflict, oil prices had climbed more than 7%. This is the part of the story that reaches far beyond the Middle East. Every driver filling up a gas tank, every business dependent on shipping costs through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most vital choke points for global oil transport, felt the financial shockwave of this ceasefire collapsing within hours of Trump's comments in Ankara. And Ankara itself deserves attention, because this entire crisis unfolded directly on top of a major NATO summit, creating an extraordinary split-screen moment in global diplomacy. While Trump was fielding questions about Iran, he was simultaneously clashing with European allies on entirely separate issues. He renewed pressure and made pointed threats regarding Spain's defense spending commitments. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, standing at the same summit, reiterated firmly that Greenland remains, in her words, not for sale, pushing back on what she described as an unfortunately clear American position on the territory. She emphasized that NATO's entire founding purpose rests on the idea that if anything happens to one member, all members respond together, a pointed reminder issued at the exact moment Trump was simultaneously threatening deeper strikes on Iran and pressuring allies over unrelated territorial and budgetary disputes. In other words, the Iran ceasefire didn't collapse in a vacuum. It collapsed in the middle of one of the tensest, most consequential NATO gatherings of the year, with American foreign policy pulling in multiple directions across multiple continents simultaneously. So where does this actually leave things? As of this recording, the current status of U.S.-Iran negotiations remains genuinely unclear. The original memorandum of understanding technically doesn't expire until mid-August, but with both sides now accusing each other of violating its terms, and with active strikes having occurred on multiple consecutive days across 5 countries when you include Iran itself, the practical reality on the ground looks far more like active conflict than a functioning ceasefire. Trump has said he isn't sure he wants to pursue a deal anymore, while simultaneously insisting the broader war isn't restarting, and that whatever is happening now will, in his words, end very quickly. Iran's leadership, through Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, has taken the opposite rhetorical posture, framing any de-escalation as something that will happen strictly on Iran's own terms, not under American pressure. Both sides are publicly projecting confidence that they hold the stronger position, which is often exactly the kind of standoff that produces further escalation rather than resolution. What should you actually watch for next? First, whether the ceasefire's technical mid-August deadline still means anything at all, given both sides are already treating it as effectively void. Second, whether the United States follows through on Trump's threat to target Iranian civilian infrastructure like electric and desalination plants, a move that would represent a dramatic escalation beyond the military and naval targets struck so far. Third, whether Iran expands its retaliation beyond drone and missile strikes on regional U.S. assets in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan into other forms of pressure, whether that's further disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, cyber activity, or leaning on proxy networks elsewhere in the region. And fourth, whether the broader diplomatic community, from Qatar's mediating role to Egypt's public condemnations, can pull both sides back toward the negotiating table before the mid-August deadline arrives, or whether that date simply becomes irrelevant because the fighting has already resumed in full by then. It's worth stepping back even further to understand how unusual Trump's rhetorical shift actually was. Just a month before declaring the ceasefire over, Trump had been publicly describing Iran's leadership in almost complimentary terms, calling them smart, very rational, and pleasant to deal with. By July 8th, that same leadership was being described by the same president as erratic and dangerous, language reserved for adversaries he considers unpredictable rather than negotiating partners. That's not a subtle shift in tone. That's a complete reversal, and it happened inside a matter of weeks. When a reporter directly asked Trump why his posture toward Tehran had changed so dramatically, his answer wasn't really about ideology or long-term strategy. It was about the vessel attacks in the Strait, in a broader sense that Iran had chosen to test the boundaries of the ceasefire rather than honor it. Whether that shift reflects a genuine change in Trump's assessment of Iran's intentions, or simply frustration boiling over after weeks of an uneasy truce, is something historians will likely debate for years. But in the moment, it was enough to end a ceasefire that had barely gotten off the ground. It's also worth remembering that this entire Iran-US conflict didn't begin in July. The ceasefire itself, signed on June 17th, came after an earlier and even more intense round of direct fighting between the two countries, following a period of Israeli-Iranian strikes that had already rattled the region for days beforehand. That original conflict saw American forces conduct strikes against Iranian nuclear-linked infrastructure, an operation significant enough that Trump referenced it directly in his Ankara comments, insisting that regardless of what happens next in this renewed round of fighting, the United States will never allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. A red line he described as more important than the specific target numbers being debated in the news that week. So while this video is focused on the last 48 hours, it's important to understand that those 48 hours are really just the latest chapter in a much longer, more volatile relationship between Washington and Tehran that has been escalating on and off for the better part of a year. Interestingly, all of this was unfolding at the exact same time as a completely separate diplomatic development involving one of Iran's neighbors. During the same NATO summit window, Syria's foreign minister posted a photo showing himself alongside Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara aboard a plane, displaying what appeared to be an official directive signed by Trump, ordering Syria's removal from the United States' list of state sponsors of terrorism, with Congress then given a 45-day window to review that decision. It's a reminder that even in the middle of an active, escalating military crisis with Iran, the broader machinery of American Middle East policy, sanctions relief, terrorism designations, regional realignments kept moving in parallel. For a region as interconnected as the Middle East, a shift in Washington's relationship with Syria doesn't happen in isolation from what's happening with Iran. Analysts will likely be parsing the connections between these moves for weeks, particularly given how directly Iran and Syria's political fortunes have been intertwined for over a decade. Let's also talk about why Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar specifically were chosen as retaliation targets, beyond simply being nearby. All three host significant American military infrastructure. Qatar is home to one of the largest American military installations in the entire region. Bahrain hosts the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, responsible for naval operations throughout the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. Kuwait has long served as a logistics and staging hub for American forces throughout the broader region. By targeting infrastructure tied to these bases, air defense systems, satellite antennas, fuel storage, Iran was sending a calculated message. It wasn't randomly lashing out. It was demonstrating that American military infrastructure across the entire Gulf region remains within reach, regardless of where the original strikes on Iranian soil took place. That's a strategic signal as much as a military one, aimed at reminding Washington and its regional partners that any future round of American strikes on Iran carries a real, geographically dispersed cost for the countries hosting U.S. forces nearby, not just for Iran and the United States directly. Before we close this out, it's worth addressing accuracy directly, because a story moving this fast, across this many countries, is exactly the kind of situation where unverified claims spread faster than confirmed ones. Every figure in this video, the roughly 90 targets struck on July 8th, the roughly 80 targets hit the day before, the casualty numbers from Iran's health ministry, the missile and drone counts intercepted by Kuwait and Jordan, comes from official statements, either from U.S. Central Command, Gulf state government ministries, or Iranian state and semi-official media, cross-checked across multiple independent outlets including CNN, The Washington Post, CNBC, Time, and NBC News. Where sources disagreed slightly, for instance, on the exact framing of Iran's intentions behind the Golistan Bridge strike, we flagged that ambiguity rather than presenting it as settled fact. In a conflict this fluid, casualty figures in particular tend to shift in the days following an event, as hospitals update records and governments issue revised statements. If you're watching this even a few days after it was made, it's worth checking for updated numbers, because a story moving this quickly rarely stays frozen in place for long. There's also a bigger strategic question sitting underneath all of this that's worth thinking about as we wrap up. Ceasefires in this region have historically been fragile arrangements, often more about buying time for exhausted militaries and cautious diplomats than genuine long-term settlements. This particular truce lasted barely 3 weeks before a handful of attacks on commercial shipping unraveled it entirely. That fragility isn't necessarily a sign that peace was never possible. It may simply reflect how difficult it is to maintain trust between two governments that, as recently as a month ago, were actively bombing each other's territory. Rebuilding that trust takes far longer than the weeks this ceasefire was given, and every side involved, from Washington to Tehran to the Gulf states caught in between, now has to decide whether it's worth trying again, or whether the region has effectively slid back into the same active conflict it was in before the Memorandum of Understanding was ever signed on June 17th. One more angle worth exploring before we wrap up is what this means for the broader security architecture that the United States has spent decades building across the Gulf. Patriot missile batteries, early warning satellite systems, fuel depots supporting naval operations. These aren't just isolated pieces of hardware. They're part of an interconnected defense network that allies in the region have relied on for protection against exactly this kind of scenario, an Iranian retaliatory strike following American action. The fact that Iran was able to identify and target a Patriot interceptor system in Kuwait, a satellite antenna site in Qatar, and fuel storage in Bahrain, all within the same overnight window, suggests a level of intelligence and coordination that regional security planners will be studying closely in the weeks ahead. It also raises uncomfortable questions for Gulf governments who host American forces, specifically because that presence was supposed to deter this kind of attack in the first place. If hosting U.S. infrastructure makes a country an active target the moment tensions between Washington and Tehran spike, that's a calculation Gulf leaders in Kuwait City, Manama, and Doha are almost certainly re-examining right now, regardless of what they're saying publicly. And that's really the deeper story underneath all the missile counts and strike totals. This isn't just a two-country conflict anymore, if it ever truly was. Every time the U.S. and Iran trade strikes, the shockwaves radiate outward, into Gulf capitals that would rather stay neutral, into global oil markets that react within hours regardless of geography, into NATO summits that were supposed to be focused on entirely different priorities, and into the daily lives of ordinary people across 5 or more countries who wake up to shelter warnings and air raid sirens because of a dispute that started with 3 commercial ships in a shipping lane. That's the real cost of a ceasefire collapsing this fast. It's not contained. It never is. Let's go back to where we started. 3 weeks ago, there was a ceasefire. There were quiet meetings in Doha. There was cautious optimism that a fragile peace might hold long enough for real negotiations to happen. Then 3 Iranian attacks on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz set off a chain reaction that, within 48 hours, produced roughly 170 combined American airstrikes across 2 rounds. A bridge hit nearly 900 miles from the original flashpoint, and Iranian retaliation against 4 separate countries in a single overnight window. 14 people dead in Iran. Dozens more injured across multiple nations. Oil prices spiking more than 7% in 2 days. And a NATO summit in Ankara transformed into the backdrop for one of the most consequential diplomatic collapses of the year. The ceasefire that was supposed to hold until mid-August didn't even survive 3 weeks. And right now, nobody, not Washington, not Tehran, not the Gulf states caught in the crossfire, can say with confidence what happens next. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand how fast this situation actually unfolded, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know which part surprised you most, whether it's the 4-country retaliation, the strike nearly 900 miles from Hormuz, or the timing alongside Khamenei's funeral. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this crisis develops, because based on everything we just covered, this story is nowhere near finished.